A number of speakers have talked about the consequences of the terrible wars that have been inflicted upon many regions of the world since 2001. We've also heard about the danger of intervention in Venezuela and Trump's aggressive militaristic policies. It's a great pleasure to welcome the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, Lindsey German, who's such a strong campaigner on these issues.
Thanks very much, Kate, and it's good to see so many people here, and congratulations on what looks like it's going to be a fantastically successful conference. I don't want to repeat all the things that previous speakers have said about how timely this is, the threat of the far right that we face across the world in terms of what's going on in Latin America, in terms of what is going on in the United States with Trump's wall, in terms of Italy, where there's a far right government, in terms of Eastern Europe, which Thomas has explained so well what is going on, and of course in our own country here in Britain, the hostile environment to migrants, which is a central part of Theresa May's policy and which continues to be a central part of Theresa May's policy, and which only yesterday the High Court actually ruled was increasing racism with the use of the way in which landlords are being forced to check on people's migration status. All of these things, we are in a very, very dangerous period, and of course we have seen the rise of the far right, not just as groups of organisations, but also the rise of the far right in governments in many, many countries across the world. And all of these things are frightening for us. As people have said, the targets of the far right and the fascists are, of course, people of different races, particularly Muslims, Jews, anybody who is organised, and I think increasingly people on the left as well. The bookshop just round the corner, Bookmarks, was attacked by fascists only last summer. The attack by a far-right fanatic in Finsbury Park last year was aimed at Jeremy Corbyn. That was the aim of the operation. So I think we have to see this as something which is of a concern absolutely to all of us, and we cannot allow ourselves to be divided in terms of our differences. We have to unite around what is a major enemy, and that is the enemy which is the far right and the governments which are giving it so much oxygen and giving it so much ability to grow at the moment. Now, I want to just talk in the few minutes I have about where I think these far right policies come from. There's three things I want to talk about. First is the wars which have been conducted non-stop for nearly 20 years now by our government, by the United States government, on mainly Muslim countries, and which are still continuing. There are still American troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. There are still a situation in Libya, which is civil war, where horrifically people are now talking about building camps in Libya to stop African migrants from being able to cross the Mediterranean to get to Europe. We have a situation where those wars have directly fueled Islamophobia, as we said they would do back in 2001. That if you occupy and invade mainly Muslim countries, you have to demonize the people that you are occupying and invading, and that is what has happened repeatedly. And when you see a rise of terrorism, as we have done, as a result of these wars, that is blamed on the people in those countries rather than on the policies which have created the basis for terrorism in the first place. And we see this repeatedly. And as Kate said, we are now seeing these similar threats to Venezuela. If this happens, if there is military intervention in Venezuela, this will be an absolutely horrific series of wars which will involve Brazil, which is one of the major military powers, will draw in more and more people in Latin America. And I think we have to understand that this racism is partly fueled by these wars. The second thing it's fueled by is the scapegoating of migrants, which is going on in a massive scale across the world today. If you look at what happened in 2015, where migrants came in large numbers, where did they come from? They came very largely from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq. What's the connection? The connection is that these people are desperate because of the wars that have been conducted in their countries. And if it isn't a question of war, people talk about economic migrants. What are economic migrants? They're people who maybe don't have water where they live, maybe can't farm any longer, partly this will get worse as a result of climate change. People who cannot make a living where they are and therefore risk the most dangerous conditions and the most degrading conditions when they get here in order to try to make a life here. Why in a continent of 503 million people can we not absorb 1 million migrants from outside our continent? Is that so difficult for us to understand? It should be something that every government is fighting for, but actually the opposite. The opposite has been the case, that government policy, not just over migration, but on a range of issues, has also fueled Islamophobia. That when you go and get NHS treatment, you have to show that you're a bona fide citizen here. That when you go to university, you are constantly, university staff are now used like border guards in order to check who is and who isn't a legitimate person here. These are things which are unacceptable. We have the prevent agenda, which has scapegoated migrants and Muslims. We have all of those things going on, and therefore I think government policy has a major part to play. And I want to just say a little word about Islamophobia. It seems to me we talk quite rightly, as all the speakers have said, we talk about zero tolerance for any form of racism against anyone whatsoever. But I have to say that I think Islamophobia is the dominant form of racism in this country and in Europe at the moment. We have governments who are banning burqas. We have governments who are banning hijabs. We have governments who are, and they seem to have a particular delight in picking on Muslim women and demanding to tell them what they can wear and what they can't wear, how they can dress when they go to the beach, all of these kinds of things. These are policies which are being fueled by the media and being fueled by government and its agencies and institutions, and they are making the situation much, much worse. So I think for us, when we talk about how we stand up, we have to stand up to Islamophobia. We have to stop the Tory scapegoating of Muslims. They talk about institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I don't accept. I don't think it's an institutionally anti-Semitic party, and I certainly don't believe that Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic. I think actually these are terrible accusations and witch-hunting accusations to make, but I do think there's a lot of evidence of institutional Islamophobia inside the Tory party. We've heard it from Baroness Wolsey, who was a leading figure in the Tory party, and we've seen it when Sajid Javid actually strips the citizenship of Shamima Begum. Now, whatever you think of Shamima Begum, and all of us, I think, will not in any way support the kind of politics that she stands for, or maybe stands for. We don't know what she exactly thinks. But this is a young woman, still only 19, who is now being used for target practice on a shooting range in the northwest of England. Who allows this kind of thing to happen? The Home Secretary allows it to happen by taking away her citizenship. That is what we're up against, and we have to fight against it. Two things to conclude. First is, we have to stand up to racists and fascists wherever they exist, and we have to organise on the streets, and we have to organise in the united way. I hope everybody will be on the streets on the 16th of March to support the Stand Up to Racism demonstration. And to do everything that we can to build a mass united anti-racist and anti-fascist movement. But secondly, we also have to stand up, as Ken Loach so rightly said, we have to stand up to the policies that are creating racism, that are dividing working class people. The reason we don't have houses is because they have stopped building council houses, and and people can't afford the private rents. The private landlords are making a fortune out of ordinary working people. It's not migrants who are doing this. It's not migrants who are paying people low wages. It's not migrants who are creating jobs at just above the minimum wage. This is a situation where we have to combat not just racism, but the causes of racism again. And speaking as a socialist personally, I've been fighting racism since I first became a socialist in the late 60s, early 70s, and I will continue to do so. But it seems to me it always comes back, as people have said, that you think you've defeated it and then it comes back. The reason for this is because we live in a rotten system which is based on profit and which is based on making sure that there is competition, not just between capitals, but between individual working people. Competition on the basis of skill, on the basis of gender, on the basis of race. This is the kind of system that will always create racism, which is why we need to fight against it as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Lindsey. Our final speaker in this session is a powerful community activist, a human rights campaigner, and a really great voice against war. Please welcome Salma Yaqub.